Hello and welcome to Introduction to Zoning, part of the Philadelphia City Planning Commission's Learning Series. In this video, you will learn what zoning is, how it evolved over time, what purposes it serves, what kinds of things zoning regulates, and how you can participate in zoning decisions. If you have ever been involved in development, either as a developer, a neighbor, or as an interested community member, you may have heard that development needs zoning approval. In this module, we'll explore what that approval is and why we have zoning. Let's return to our three developers. Pamela has bought an empty lot and wants to build a new house. Nadia, Pamela's neighbor, wants to renovate her house, and Maurice, Nadia's brother, owns a corner building where he wants to open a smoothie shop. Each of our three developers will need a zoning permit to move ahead with their projects. So let's get to our first question. What is zoning? To start to answer this question, we'll begin with the word itself, zoning. It's called zoning because zoning rules typically divide a city into zones. Each zone has different rules that make the most sense for that location. Zoning rules are laws. They're approved by the city's legislative body. Here in Philadelphia, City Council adopts zoning legislation. Zoning laws can encompass a huge variety of very detailed rules, but at their core, zoning's essential role is to place reasonable limits on property rights so that residents and businesses can have clear expectations about how properties near them will be used now and in the future. Zoning rules help cities function and reduce conflict between neighbors. But wait, isn't private property private? Can't each individual owner do as they please with their land? Well, it's not quite that simple. Under the U.S. system of property law, owners of property have what's called a bundle of rights. The bundle can be separated, and the individual rights can be sold or limited by the government. These rights include access, sale, habitation, construction, producing or selling goods, and many others. So another way to think about zoning would be to consider it a system for defining which of these rights are compatible with the public good in any given location. To understand today's zoning rules, we should look at their origins in the early 1900s. Zoning began as a response by local governments to the unprecedented rapid growth of American cities brought on by industrialization and migration. Zoning evolved in a piecemeal fashion around the country, driven at different times and different places to achieve different goals. Prominent goals evident in early zoning codes were separation of residences from the odors, noise, dust, and pollution of industry, and setting maximum densities in an effort to prevent cramped and potentially unsanitary housing conditions. Some early zoning codes enforced racial segregation by limiting neighborhoods to whites only. These codes were racist and discriminatory reactions to the Great Migration of African Americans fleeing oppression and seeking better opportunities in northern industrial cities. Now, by 1917, racial zoning had been declared unconstitutional in a Supreme Court decision, but private race restrictions, which were written into deeds by developers, remained common throughout the 1950s. Public and private race restrictions had a huge and lasting impact on settlement and development patterns in U.S. cities, even in cities without open segregation laws. Over many decades, zoning rules have evolved. While zoning codes may cover hundreds of topics and include many specific details, most codes today have three basic functions. The first and most essential function of zoning in today's world is to protect health and safety by preventing the overcrowding and exposure to pollutants experienced in American cities in the early 1900s. A second basic function is to set expectations about what can happen on private property. For example, a residential zoning usually prevents property owners from starting businesses that would create smoke, dust, or noise. Rules like this reassure residents and owners that their property will not be affected negatively by changes to their neighbor's property. And contrary to racist zoning goals of the early 20th century, zoning can also be a tool for residents and their elected leaders to work towards important goals such as providing housing and finding locations for new parks and other public resources. Ideally, these goals are included in a comprehensive plan, which lays out a vision for the future. Zoning rules are one way that cities can realize that vision. They can be used to support justice, equity, and opportunity. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of zoning. What exactly does zoning regulate? Zoning rules cover a wide variety of topics, but most zoning rules basically govern use and bulk. Use rules set limits on how a property can be used, such as for homes, stores, and factories. Bulk rules deal with the size and shape of buildings and where they can be placed on the lot. Uses are categorized by their function. One example of a use is a house. Some uses produce side effects that might go unnoticed in an industrial setting, but would be unpleasant to actually live near. Zoning regulates use so that incompatible uses don't end up right next to each other. Zoning also regulates bulk, or the size and shape of buildings. For example, zoning sets limits on how tall and how close together buildings are allowed to be. Bulk rules prevent overcrowding, maintain access to light and air, and encourage development that harmonizes with what's already there. While zoning rules are powerful, there are a couple of caveats. The biggest one, zoning rules only apply to new buildings and big changes to existing ones. While zoning can reflect a vision of how land will develop in the future, it can't be used to force the closure of pre-existing uses or otherwise deprive a property owner of their right to keep using a property just as they always have. Another important caveat is that zoning doesn't regulate everything about buildings. For example, building codes regulate construction details and energy efficiency. Zoning is too blunt to regulate aesthetic choices or problems like litter, crime, and vacancy. Zoning doesn't control whether homes are rented out, how well properties are maintained, or other aspects of people's behavior. Zoning rules are made up of two parts. The zoning code, or zoning text, contains the written rules of zoning. The rules include a classification system of zoning districts. Different districts have different rules. The zoning map is a map of the city that shows which zoning districts apply in which areas. To find out which zoning rules apply to a piece of land, you would first check the zoning map to see which districts cover that land. Then, the zoning code can tell you which rules apply in that zoning district. So let's return to our three developers. Each of them has learned a little bit more about zoning. Now they're reconsidering their development ideas. Pamela's house is a single-family use. She checks the zoning map and finds that her lot is in a zoning district that allows single-family homes. She can file for a zoning permit with her design. Nadia had originally planned a third-floor addition with 15-foot high ceilings. She checks the height limits for her zoning district and finds that her third floor would exceed the maximum height. Nadia decides to take a few feet off her design to make it comply. She wants to get her project underway and doesn't mind losing the extra height. Maurice is hoping to open a smoothie shop, but finds out that his building is in a zoning district where that type of business is not permitted. However, he's been working with his neighbors and knows that they support his business idea. Luckily for Maurice, there is a zoning appeal process. He decides to file an appeal. You can learn more about how zoning appeals work in our series of videos on registered community organizations. Are you interested in participating in zoning decisions? Get started by learning what zoning districts cover your neighborhood. Get a copy of the Zoning Quick Guide from the link in the description. Look at the district plan for your part of the city to find out if any changes have been proposed. Watch the City Planning Commission agenda for proposed changes in your area and weigh in at hearings. Your community planner on the Planning Commission staff will be happy and able to help you with all these and more, so feel free to reach out. In this video, you learned about the following: what zoning is, how it evolved, what purposes it serves, what zoning regulates, and how you can participate. Thank you for watching this presentation on zoning in Philadelphia. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this useful, and don't forget to check out the other videos in this series.